And now we'd like to welcome Rabbi Dan Geffen from Sag Harbor.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, everybody. It's great to see all of you. It's great to be back. First, apologies for the mess behind me. I was so busy thinking about thought this whole week that I forgot to clean my room. But you'll forgive me. I know you're very thoughtful people in that way. So as I've done the last few times, I like to bring texts and I like to make sure that we're all looking at the same text together. And, also a good excuse not to see this background or myself as much. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see it. I'm going to zoom in as best as I can. So I titled this presentation, Thinking, the Cause of and Solution to All of Life's Problems. And lest you think that I'm some witty person that came up with this title, it's actually a very deep cut Simpsons reference that somehow or another Elizabeth recognized immediately when I sent it to her. So she is immediately one of my most favorite people. But really, in truth, there is something to this, right? That on the one hand, thinking is one of the greatest things that we are capable. It's one of the things that in some ways distinguishes us as human beings. And at the same time, it is oftentimes the cause of some of our greatest pain. And so I wanted to try to explore this idea, certainly bringing, as a rabbi, bringing some of the Jewish aspect into it, but I think hopefully ending in a more universal kind of place. And some of these texts may be somewhat familiar or completely foreign, but I'll try to move through them, keeping an eye on my time and making sure that we don't get too lost. So the first place I want to go is a very important text in Jewish thought and Jewish wisdom. It's the Book of Proverbs. It's part of the last section of what we call the Tanakh, the books of the writings. And it's the basis of Jewish philosophy, Jewish thought, Jewish ethics. There are many things that expand upon it, but ultimately it's one of our sort of core foundational texts when it comes to figuring out really who we are and what we are meant to be and how we're meant to act. And it should just be said that as we're seeing right here, we're looking at the beginning of the book, the attribution of Proverbs is to King Solomon, David's son, who builds the first temple in Jerusalem. We, of course, have no idea whether that is factually correct, but that's at least traditionally the way that it's understood. So King Solomon begins with sort of opining on this bigger idea of how are we meant to use our minds, right? How are we meant to use our intellect? And so this is really actually should be sort of one long sentence, but it's really sort of 7 verses. And it says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for learning wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of discernment, for acquiring the discipline for success, righteousness, justice, and equity, for endowing the naive with shrewdness, the young with knowledge and foresight, the wise man, and again, I apologize, it's all gendered language because of how it begins, but we're understanding this much more broadly than that, I hope, right? The wise person hearing them will gain more wisdom. The discerning person will learn to be adroit. For understanding, proverb and epigram, the words of the wise and their riddles. And now here's the key piece where it becomes a religious kind of idea, is that in order to achieve all of these things, the basic idea is that a reverence for God is the beginning of all of this knowledge. And that we understand that really only, quote unquote, the fool will despise wisdom and discipline. So here is, again, the sort of basis in Judaism for a primary focus on the idea of developing one's capacity to think. And from one's capacity to think, one's capacity to understand concepts like righteousness and justice and equity and discipline. But ultimately speaking, the only route to all of this, at least according to Solomon and according to sort of traditional religious thought, is to begin with a sense of divinity, right? And I think for New Thought in particular, you have to sort of filter this through your own understanding of God and your relationship to God. But I think each of us, again, in that sort of pursuit of understanding what God is to each and every one of us, we are activating this element of ourselves, right? Beginning with a sense of our purpose and our connection and using it to develop our capacity to think, and from our capacity to think to change. Now, to really drill down on this a little further, we'll go back to the Torah itself, to the book of Deuteronomy, to one of actually the most important texts in Jewish liturgy. This is a section that is read twice a day. Traditionally, it's part of what is referred to as the Shema, and it's following prayers. But basically, it is, you'll see, an enjoining to take this both thinking, learning, teaching, and take it very seriously. So it says, take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So just as a point of clarification, those last couple of lines, the rabbis took them quite literally to the point where traditionally speaking, there are what are called phylacteries. You may have seen them, sort of a leather binding that is attached literally to the arm and between the forehead. And if you go to a Jewish person's home, you'll oftentimes find on the outside of a doorpost something called a mezuzah. And that is basically a callback to this idea. But principally, what's being described here? The idea is that we need to be thinking, we need to be deeply engaged, basically every day, everywhere we go or don't. And we have to make sure that that thinking is also going to be transmitted to the next generation as well. And to literally, right, consider it as part of our physical being, so that no matter what, it's almost as if we are clothed in armor, an armor of the capacity to think and to connect to the deeper questions of life. Okay, so this is drilled into every young Jewish person as they are growing up, as the idea that no matter where we go, no matter what we do, no matter our capacity, quote unquote, we are constantly in a state of thought. We are constantly in a state of consideration. So this actually turns out to be empirically correct, or at least we are finding out more and more as of 2020, and this is the most recent study that I could find. Department of Psychology, Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, one of a number of places that have been studying thought in the human mind from a neuroscientific scientific perspective, right, is to try to understand, how do we quantify something like thinking? And so they actually figured out a sort of novel concept by studying the human brain as going through a number of sort of daily processes. And they've determined that the average human being on an average day has somewhere in the vicinity of 6,000 thoughts. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean 6,000 individual thoughts or unique thoughts, but 6,000 times in which, as I'll read here, the scientists determined, right, we had a breakthrough by giving up on trying to understand what a person is thinking about and instead focusing on when they have moved on. Our methods help us detect when a person is thinking something new without regard to what the new thought is. You could say that we've skipped over vocabulary in an effort to understand the punctuation of the language of the mind. So why is this relevant? It's to suggest the fact that thinking, right, is an incredible process, one that we do more times a day than we would ever really even begin to comprehend. And it's not necessarily that we are coming up with 6,000 new ideas every day. It's simply that our mind is moving between different thoughts at that kind of pace. Now, if you were to break that down by minute, okay, it means that basically our constant state of being, including even really when we are asleep, is in a process of thinking. So here's where we get into the problem, right? We've learned that thinking is a great thing principally, but reality is, and I think all of us know this, there is also the extreme in the other direction, right? We can think till it hurts. So this is a quote from Eckhart Tolle, who I actually was not so familiar with before, but a rather interesting writer and speaker, born in Germany, now lives primarily in Canada. So he says, right, not to be able to stop thinking is a dreadful affliction, but we don't realize this because almost everybody is suffering from it. So it's considered normal. This incessant mental noise prevents you from finding the realm of inner stillness that is inseparable from being. It also creates a false mind-made self that casts a shadow of fear and suffering. Now, this may not be the case for everybody at all times, but I've been very surprised that a human being can be born and live a full life and leave this world and not understand this text in a very real kind of way. Okay, some of us, as I joked at the beginning, right, think too much. I am too much of a thinker, right? Anybody ever watch The Good Place? Have you ever watched The Good Place? If not, this is a show Rabbi Dan recommends. Watch The Good Place. It's a brilliant show, and it has a character on the show who has what's basically paralysis of thought. He's a moral philosopher, and every single decision that he has to make becomes an existential question. Okay, each one of us, we don't have to be in that extreme, but we oftentimes will find ourselves struggling mightily just to figure out what to eat, right? What the clothes to put on, right? And that's the simple, superfluous stuff when we really think about it, right? Did I say the right thing to that person? Did I do the right thing at work? Does my spouse think that I am still attractive, right? All of these things all day long, our mind goes whether we want it to or not. And it takes a tremendous amount of discipline, which is why I think it's really wonderful that part of your service is focusing on that discipline of quieting our minds, of trying to find that stillness, because it's actually really hard. And just as it's being described here, because everybody is basically in the same boat, it seems normal. If we acknowledge it as actually something of a challenge, we might approach it in a somewhat different fashion. So as I titled this again, thinking being both the cause of and the solution to life's problems, we see that there is the possibility of both, right? We can think great thoughts, we can develop ourselves, we can develop humanity. But sometimes when we get into the point in which, for example, real issues are taking place in front of us that need decisions, that need action, and we spend our time having academic conversations or arguments with each other over the exact right path, while people die, while people starve, there is such a thing as paralysis of thought. And so we have to be conscious and conscientious of that fact, because it's not just about institutions or countries that fall into these categories, it's each and every one of us, and very likely on a daily basis. So if we think about it, right, both from the positive of the fact that we have brains that are capable of 6,000 thoughts a day, and what that means over a lifetime, to also be conscious of the fact that not all 6,000 of those thoughts are going to be helpful or good. So the next quote comes from William James, who is one of the more foremost thinkers in early American psychology. By these days standards, I can't vouch for the body of his work, but from sort of a historical perspective, he's considered to be quite an important thinker, both from an academic perspective and also from within the discipline of psychology. But he points out one of the other challenges of thinking, which is that a great many people think they are thinking when they are merely rearranging their prejudices. Okay, so what he means by that, or at least what I think he means by that, is that we oftentimes think of ourselves as being much more open-minded than we are, right? That we are capable of taking in new thought at any regular point and investing in it and changing as a result of it. But the reality is that most human beings, probably because of our neuropathology, are not really wired that way. We're actually wired really to turn over our own ideas more than to take in new ones. And part of that challenge, of course, and that we're learning that, I think actually it's one of the great things that's going on in the world today, even if it's hard, is forcing us to consider what are our prejudices, right? What are the thoughts that have emerged in our mind without our calling them consciously, but that affect the way that we interact with people, the way that we think about people, the way that we engage with the world. Okay, every one of us have prejudices, whether you like it or not. It's not a question of a positive or negative attribution. It's simply an idea that our previous thoughts determine how we engage with new encounters and new people and new ways of thinking. So we have to be very cautious of that as well, which is to say that I love each and every one of you, and I'm sure that you are all very capable thinkers, as I like to think I am as well. But we have to be very careful that we don't become hubristic in that thought. Right? That we don't begin to think that we are the epitome of thought, that our thoughts are superior to those of our neighbor or our friend or even our antagonizer or our enemy, which I know is really hard to consider, but there are times in which even people who drive us up the wall may have a point, okay? And even when people who really have no ability to call us out for something and point it out, that doesn't mean that what they're calling out is not true, or at least partially true. So we have to be really careful also of the possibility that our prejudices can influence us as well. So I want to bring it back to a Hebrew text before we close out. And this comes from the other great text of Jewish wisdom, which I've used a few times here with you guys, which is from what's called Pirkei Avot. And this is sort of an inherited wisdom of the sages, the rabbis of the earliest generations, which largely begin around 200 BCE and then kind of carry through the period of the Talmud, which is about 600 CE or so. So Rabbi Gamliel, who was a big shot in his day, he used to say, the more Torah, the more life. The more sitting in the company of the scholars, the more wisdom. The more counsel, the more understanding. The more charity, the more peace. If one acquires a good name, he has acquired something for himself. But if one acquires for himself knowledge of Torah, right, and we'll again broaden this idea out, right, knowledge of really the wisdom of whatever tradition it is that you come from, or whatever bodies of sacred text or ways of being that you find most meaningful, right? When we acquire that, we have acquired life also in the world to come. And just to sort of, package this all together, what Rabbi Gamliel is saying, and why, again, it may be it's also something to do with the fact that the Jewish people lived most of the last 2,000 years without the power or control to be focused on things like, militaries and conquests and things of that nature. We mostly didn't have a choice, so we sat around and we studied with what we could. But by and large, the main idea here, going back to Proverbs and being picked up here, is the idea that really thinking, that knowledge, that wisdom, that the capacity of the human mind to create, all of these things are the main pursuit, or ought to be the main pursuit of life. And that when we do the kind of deep thinking that changes us, that evolves us, that pushes us to be better, that helps our fellow human being, that creates new possibilities, that ends hunger, that ends sickness, that ends warfare, right? This kind of thinking is where we need to put our energies. But we also need to be very guarded against the negative kinds of thinking, both the self-destructive kind, what we think about ourselves, okay, what we put on ourselves, the guilt that we oftentimes attribute to things that are not our fault, the feelings that we have about our bodies or our identities, right? Those kinds of thoughts, which are not productive, which are actually destructive, are the things that we also have to be conscious of. And while we aren't capable of being aware of the 6,000 thoughts that are firing every single day, we can be more conscious of the fact that when a thought emerges within us, to be mindful of the fact that that thought is not necessarily correct, and in many cases actually can be quite distorted. And rather than taking our thoughts as immediate gospel, to take the time to really contemplate and to ask a question of it, right? If I think of something that is problematic, to ask, who is this helping? Is this helping me? Is this helping the people next to me? Is this helping my community? Is this positive? Is this productive? Is this what God ultimately wants of my life? Those are the kinds of thoughts and questions that we need to focus more of our energy on, and to do what we can to support each other in the process of limiting as much as possible the negative kinds of thoughts. So my last teaching for this morning is from my opinion, the greatest sage of all time, Winnie the Pooh. Did you ever stop to think and forget to start again? And so the main thing to leave you with is to say this: while there are dangers of thinking, let's not forget to think, okay? Let's make sure that actually we put it higher up on our agenda and our list, okay? It's very, very important. It is fundamental to each of us, regardless of religion, regardless of belief. Thinking is one of the greatest gifts as a religious person that God ever gave to humanity. So let's do our best to use it for good purpose. And certainly I can't think of a better purpose than being with all of you again this morning. So thank you as always for your attention. I hope some of that made some kind of sense. And we'll have some feedback time, hopefully, so we'll learn whether it did or it didn't. But I look forward to the rest of this time and hopefully being back again soon.